Yeah, that's interesting. I had another friend, a trans guy, email me and say like, that's great. It feels like it's finally opening some space. But
Yes.
you know, like like he's like, oh, I hope you like flesh it out in the next one. And I'm like, I don't know what that means exactly. Like, like we can go farther into the details of the specifics, which I think is important. But and I don't know that we will do a next one.
Mhm.
But like what you're saying, and what John was kind of also provoking was like, okay, now that we're like looking at the ontology of gender, we also want to look at the normativity, like kind of simultaneously. And I think that made sense to me the more we talked. I think partly because I was feeling like the frustration around ontology like subsiding. Like I was like, oh, this is really satisfying. And now I can see how we need to like, look at gender, like, hopefully, beyond the culture wars, but like what it should be as well as what it is kind of simultaneously, because I think it is one of those funky transjective things that is
Mhm.
objective and subjective at the same time. And so bridges is ought divide really, really well. It's a really good
Mhm.
case of that happening.
Mhm. I think maybe my hope for it, or sort of the idea of what's next, and maybe that happens with you and John and Greg, or maybe that's magically happens between you and I, or I love the idea of that. But I think for me, it sort of comes down to, why I developed that collective intelligence campfire, like why I created that course, the Dialogue OS kernel course, because for me, the hope is that we can, as we start to sort of focus more on this object and get a better sense of it, any actions we take towards it are more sustainable. They are more nuanced. They are more complex. So it's
Mhm.
almost the idea for me, it's like, what's next? It's like it occurs to me like, that's a great primer of like, this is the conversation we should be having around gender. But now it's like, can we take that framework and start actually turning it into sustainable change? And because we talked before about like the problems with some of the laws and the oversimplifications here, and gender affirming emphasis, and all the sort of downsides to that. It's like, how can we again further this, so hopefully such that the people who I don't know what we want to say, need to transition, or doing it in a cleaner, healthier, whether that's mental or physically or both sort of way. And then we're also not capturing or catching up people who maybe are just a little bit more on the confused and more on the, identity, who am I sort of end of things.
Yeah.
And they're not, getting caught up in a particular, what we tend to refer to as a social contagion,
Mhm.
such that they end up making changes that they later regret, and we've talked about this a little bit before. Maybe people are always going to get caught up in sort of the tornado of that, and I still like the idea of minimizing the
Yeah.
maximizing where it needs to be maximized and minimizing where it needs to be minimized. And I think the way that we're going about it right now isn't doing a really great job of that. So I'm hoping that this more nuanced conversation, with, like you said, opening up more space, gives us an opportunity to, when we're really talking about the way something should be culturally, I hate
Yeah.
should, but that we're
Right.
actually taking this into consideration. So, yeah, but what about this over here? If we do it this way, we're leaving a huge gap over here in this area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that like as you're talking, I'm thinking about how, the trans issue is situated within a gender issue and then a meaning crisis issue outside of all that, and I'm hoping that all three layers of that, I mean, they would have to interact, I'm imagining,
Hmm.
um, in order to work. And like, okay, so part of the trans issue is like, okay, what happens with cis people though? Like, that's a whole wider conversation that I was hoping we could spark, with John and Greg, and then of course you and me like talking, as well, and like understanding like, okay, do we need another, like a reinventio of gender, and that's why I would love to bring more like cis people of different stripes into this conversation, more, different non-binary, trans, whatever people as well. But I really am hoping that like you said, that what's getting called the social contagion can be sort of dealt with appropriately, I guess. I mean, it's a tricky one, but I do see it with some of the kids I work with. Like I see
Mhm.
them thinking they're this, and then they back off from that. Oh, maybe I'm just traumatized, or whatever it is. Maybe I have
Mhm.
a meaningless life in other ways and no friends, and so I'm
Mhm.
resorting to this. And they are really thinking about it. This isn't like a
Mm.
conservative talking point entirely.
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, I would certainly hope that that's the case. And for those who are seeking help from others, the idea that those others can hold a broader, more complex perspective. And of course, you, I see, is definitely one of those people who can do that. And we also see examples, however cherry picked they were in the documentary, you have people who are very sort of silent or ideological or one sided about the issue, and they're not bringing in that nuance, and therefore that's going to impact the way that they're affirming or denying, or whatever that is. So
Yeah.
yeah, but I think that's maybe a great thing to sort of dive into and sort of talk a little bit about, because I've heard you name this, and it was in that conversation as well, sort of this connection of gender and aspiration. And maybe this touches a bit into, being less trans specific, but also, for cis people, it's like, what's sort of the perspective or the frame that you're holding when you think of gender as aspirational? Like how would you lay the groundwork for what you mean by that?